Okay, here we are in Fusion, and similar to before, my caveats about SketchUp, while I'm well-versed in SketchUp, I am still coming up to speed on Fusion, and by no means am I an expert. But I have figured a few things out, and I'm gonna share those things with you in this video in basically how I've connected the dots for myself between SketchUp and Fusion. Still a long way to go, but I'm starting to get comfortable with it, and we'll walk through that in this example here. Also similar to SketchUp, this is a licensed version of Fusion. I was able to find it discounted during a sale that they ran, so I'd be on the lookout for those. The kick in the pants for me was CNC. One of the things that SketchUp does not have built into it is the CAM functionality, which is incredibly important when it comes to CNC. Now there's ways to use SketchUp with other software that does have CAM built in, so that's one way I do use it. I use SketchUp combined with something called VCAR from Vectric, and we'll look into that later on. But Fusion has it all built in. And so inevitably, that's going to be the go-to for me, but I'm still getting. Okay, so here we are in Fusion, and in Fusion, there's a lot going on here, but from a design perspective, everything starts with a sketch. You don't generally model in 3D directly in Fusion. You generally model in 2D via sketches, and then perform operations on the objects that you created in those sketches to generate 3D bodies or components from those. So here we are in the design view, and we'll go ahead and create a sketch. And when you start creating a sketch, the first thing that Fusion is asking you is, all right, what plane, because we're modeling in 2D, do you want to model on? Now, if you were paying attention, this should draw some parallels to what we did in SketchUp earlier. If you remember, I looked at the model from the right-hand camera view and began modeling on that plane. We're gonna do the same thing here. So I've got this sort of front-facing plane, this top-bottom facing plane, and this side plane, and that's the one we're gonna select right there. And then you'll notice with our sort of widget viewfinder above here, it's looking at it from the right. If I were to go home, that's from that ISO view, and I could pivot around as well, but by default, we want to be looking at this from the right-hand side. So exactly what we did in SketchUp before. Also, just like SketchUp, the first thing that I'm going to do is draw a helpful bounding box to establish the height of our frustum. So I'll go ahead and click on the rectangle tool here, and I like to start in the origin. A lot of people will draw from the center out, but that's how I like to do things. And I'm going to go ahead and click and pull, and just like in SketchUp, you can pull and click to establish directly, or you can enter the dimensions. It's a little bit more obvious in Fusion, in my opinion, because you see the dimensions in those input boxes along the width and the height, or the length and the height, however you look at that. So I'll go ahead and just enter those, 14, and instead of a comma, you tab between those. So I'll tab and enter 14 here and hit enter. And now we've just drawn a 14 by 14 square. And also like SketchUp, we weren't quite sure how zoomed in or zoomed out we were. We're way zoomed in. So it has this fit, which is the same as zoom extents in SketchUp. So if I click that, it'll fit the view with whatever it is that we have on our canvas. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually designate this box as sort of a guide. Remember in SketchUp, we chose not to do that. We just drew a square and use that as part of our model. We could have drawn it with guides. We would have had to draw 4 guides. In Fusion, you do it a little bit differently. You draw your object. So in this case, we drew a rectangle, or a square, excuse me. And then you can designate that square or that object with a line type of construction. If you look at the sketch palette over here, that tells Fusion that we want to use that for construction purposes, for drawing purposes, but we don't want that to be part of our actual model. And so that's exactly what we're using this for. And so changing this to a construction guide is perfect. And you'll notice it's hard to see, but it changed those lines from solid to dashed. All right, now let's go ahead and draw the line that will represent that side angle, the profile again. And in Fusion, it's a little bit different. If you remember in SketchUp, we first used the protractor to draw an angled guide. In Fusion, you do that in one step. So when you draw a line, there's an angular component to it. So I'll go ahead and select line, click on this origin point here. And now you'll notice, do you see the angular dimension there at the upper right? Right now it's 29.5 degrees. So again, we want an angle that yields us that whole number bevel. And that's where it's nice here to come reference our model in SketchUp to do the same thing. The other thing you'll notice is, this is what I mentioned before, is Fusion, at least by default, references off of the horizontal line rather than the vertical. And so that's why this complement is handy, because we actually want that 58.3 as our angle, not the 31.7. All right, so let's go ahead and enter that. Now you'll notice currently it's in the length. We want to tab out of that. Now we're in the angle, and I can go ahead and type in 58.3. And now notice how it's locked our line to that angle. That's called a constraint. And so whatever we do from here, it's going to lock that in unless we make a change there. The next thing we want to do is come down here to the bottom, just like we did before, and finish our line where it intersects that construction line of our rectangle, of our square. That will, again, establishes a side angle of, 31.7 degrees. That will yield a height of 14 inches. And then, since this is a construction guide, we actually need to draw another line down here at the bottom. So I'll click in there and just follow along that guide till we get to this intersection point there. And now we have the start of our side profile represented. Just like in SketchUp, we now need to offset that a desired thickness. The nice thing here is that we don't need to select anything. Fusion sort of already knows. So here's the offset tool here. And if I come and just mouse over that, notice how it's selected those two line segments, they're connected. So I can literally just click on that, and then I can pull in either direction. And again, we want to pull this direction 1 inch to establish that thickness. One slight difference here is that SketchUp sort of works in absolutes, right? So it's 1 inch either direction, whereas Fusion, you'll notice it's actually a negative number going in this direction and a positive number going this direction, right? So we actually want a -1 for our offset. So I'll just go ahead and type that in, -1, hit enter. The final thing we need to do is, again, because we established our box as a construction guide, is we need to close off this top and this bottom side over here to turn that into an enclosed face. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'll zoom in a little bit because that'll help. Again, using the middle mouse wheel on my line tool, come in here, intersects right over there where it snaps. Got that one. Now we've got a closed line there. And then I want to come down here and do the same thing. So you'll notice that it's kind of faint, but you'll notice that faint box, it's helping me indicate that it's, on a point or intersection or a line, right? So I want that. And then I'll come up here and I got the same thing right there. And there's a visual cue that we enclosed it correctly because now that area has turned blue. And that's very similar if we were to look at SketchUp and look at this from the side view, zoom in over here, and if I select that area in there, right, that also indicates that that is an enclosed face. So at this point, we've modeled the profile of our frustum in basically the same way, or Fusion's way, of doing the same thing in SketchUp. We can now finish this sketch and move on to modeling that top sort of path that we want to extrude along. So I'll go ahead and click Finish Sketch. And just like we did in SketchUp, for a sanity check, if I click the home, I'm looking at this from an ISO view and I can kind of see a little bit of where I am in space. I've got a couple things turned off, but if I were to turn on things like the layout grid, you can start to see that and how that relates to, right, where we are. All right, so now let's go ahead and draw that path, right? The 28 by 28 square that represents the top of our frustum. One of the nice things in Fusion is we don't have to move stuff around. We don't have to move geometry out of the way to prevent it conflicting with one another. It knows, right? It knows because it treats this thing that we've just drawn as its own object. And you'll see this sketch one here. In fact, we can rename that. And let's go ahead and call that Frustum Profile. So let's create a new sketch to represent that top part of the frustum. So I'll go ahead and create a new sketch. Just like before, it's prompting me what plane do I want to draw on. This time I want to draw on this plane here. Now I'm looking at it from the top down, and again, you'll see in our widget over here, it's indicating as such. All I need to do now is just draw a square. So 2-point rectangle, right? Start at the origin, draw my way out, 28, tab 28, zoom extents, or fit in this case. And as a sanity check, I can look at it from the ISO view. I see my profile over here. Here's my path. Go ahead and finish that sketch. And we will call this Frustum top, for lack of a better term, or Frustum path, either one. All right, now that we've got those two sketches of objects, now we can use our functionality to create 3D objects from those. And just like in SketchUp, we might think that we would use extrude, which is actually named extrude in Fusion rather than push-pull. So I can do the same thing here, right? And pull that out, push it in, but same thing, right? It's just a linear extrusion. It doesn't know anything about a path. So that's not what we want. Instead, what we want is what's called a sweep. A sweep in Fusion is pretty much analogous to follow me in SketchUp. So let's go ahead and click sweep. And then you'll notice in this dialog over here, we'll keep the type at single path for right now. There's lots of different options that can get pretty sophisticated in a hurry, but we'll keep it simple. And it's asking for a profile and a path. And the cool thing is you can do it in either order. By default, it does it in the reverse order that we saw in SketchUp. So it's first asking me for the profile, this, and now it's asking me for the path I want to sweep that along. So I'll go ahead and select that square path. And just like we saw in SketchUp, it's automatically swept that and generated what they call a body representing the frustum at that 1-inch thickness, 28-inch top, 14 inches tall, with that side angle that we specified. I can hit OK. The other thing I'll do real quick here is let's go ahead and X that out. I could have done this in the exact same order that we did in SketchUp by first selecting our path, right? That's what we did in SketchUp, and then selecting the profile to sweep along that path. And there you go. It generates the same object. Fusion just gives us some more flexibility in how we specify those. All right. Well, there you go. There's our three-dimensional frustum, 28 by 28. 14 inches tall with a, what was that angle again? 31.7 degrees side angle. And like we did before, we can do a quick sanity check, but rather than using the angular dimensions or the dimensions tool, Fusion has built into it the ability to inspect and do all kinds of measurements. So the hotkey for that is I, but I can go ahead and select it here, measure. That'll open this dialog, and then you can measure any object relative to any other object you want. So for example, if I just select this top line segment here, as we would expect, it's 28 inches long. But then I can select a second object. So in this case, I'll select this line segment on the side. There you go, 62.3 degrees. It's actually 62.279, but 60.2.3 is pretty darn accurate. And again, if we verify that over and look at this, I think it's from the front, there's our 62.3 degrees. At this point, we have modeled the frustum, SketchUp, and Fusion in a very similar way. So that's great. As I mentioned before, one of the things I sort of notice with this model is the proportions are a little off to me. Would work totally fine for a planter, totally fine for a water feature, for a firebowl. Looks a little bit too top heavy. So in the next video, we're now going to iterate and refine our design and make changes. And that's where I think you're going to see where Fusion's power really shines with this concept of what's called parametric modeling. Hope this was helpful. It was really fun for me to go through this first set of exercises. If you've got any comments or feedback or suggestions, let me know, and I'll be happy to address those. Otherwise, look for the next video where we make some changes and refine our model using parametric modeling.